The signal came out of the dark like a scream. It arrived at the edge of Krill space, a weak, broken pulse of radio noise, riding on old human frequencies that the Krill Empire had learned to recognize during the last war. The signal repeated itself over and over, garbled by distance and time, but the meaning was clear enough once the translators cleaned it up. This is the colony ship New Haven. We are under attack. Our defenses are gone. We have wounded. We have children. We have nothing left to fight with. If anyone can hear this, please, we need help, please. The message looped for 11 seconds, then repeated. It had been repeating, the analysts guessed, for almost 3 weeks, before a Krill listening post finally caught it. On the bridge of the Krill war cruiser Ashwin Talon, Fleet Commander Thal Voss stood with his arms crossed behind his back, listening to the signal for the 4th time. His crew waited in silence around him, the low hum of the ship's systems the only sound besides the looping human voice. Thal Voss was not a young officer. He had fought humans before, decades ago, in the short and brutal border war that the history books on his homeworld called the First Correction. He remembered what humans were like back then. Loud, stubborn, hopelessly outmatched. The Krill fleet had crushed 3 human battle groups in a single campaign season, and the surviving human ships had fled so fast that Krill pilots joked about it for years afterward. Humanity had begged for peace within 4 months. It had been an easy war, almost not worth remembering, except that it proved once again what every Krill officer already believed. Organic species that had not yet mastered true fleet doctrine were not real threats. They were obstacles, sometimes useful ones. "Play it again," Thal Voss said. His communications officer, a younger Krill named Resave, tapped the console, and the signal filled the bridge once more. Static. A human voice. Female. Cracking with what sounded like exhaustion and fear. "This is the colony ship New Haven. We are under attack." "It is old," Resave said when the message ended. 3 weeks old, maybe more, based on the drift pattern in the signal timestamp. Whatever attacked them, it is long finished by now. There will be nothing left to save. "Then we will find out what is left," Thal Voss said, "and we will learn who did this. If it is pirates, we destroy them and take their ship as tribute. If it is a rival empire moving into contested space, we need to know now, before they grow bold enough to try the same thing against a Krill world." A junior officer near the tactical station, a broad-shouldered Krill named Dorn Kale, shifted uncomfortably. "Commander, with respect, is it wise to divert the fleet this far from the patrol route? Command did not authorize a rescue mission into unclaimed space." Thal Voss turned his head slowly toward the young officer. "Command authorized me to protect Krill interests along this frontier, a distress signal in contested territory, using human-coded frequencies. 3 jumps from a human colony we know exists is a Krill interest. If humans are dying out here, that is either an opportunity or a warning. I intend to find out which." He did not say the other thing he was thinking, the thing that sat quietly under his confidence like a stone at the bottom of a river. Humans had been strange lately, quiet. For the last several years, Krill long-range sensors had noted a curious pattern. Human trade routes had grown more cautious. Human colony ships had begun traveling in larger, better organized convoys, and human military communications, the little of it the Krill could intercept, had gone almost completely dark. No boasting. No political posturing. No leaked reports of new weapons programs meant to intimidate rivals, the way lesser species so often did when trying to seem strong. Just silence. Thal Voss had noticed the silence. He simply hadn't understood yet what it meant. "Set a course," he said. "Full fleet, we follow the signal to its source. I'm far away, in a control room, buried 300 meters beneath the surface of a moon that did not appear on any commercial star chart. Fleet Admiral Elena Cross watched a wall of monitors light up with a single word. Contact. She was 51 years old, silver starting to show at her temples, and she had spent the last 9 years of her life preparing for exactly this moment. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply leaned forward, set down the mug of coffee she had been holding for the last 2 hours without drinking, and said, in a voice that was calm, because she had trained it to be calm, "Confirm identification." A young lieutenant at the sensor station, barely 26, read off the numbers as they scrolled past his screen. Fleet signature matches Krill Empire long-range cruiser configuration. 8 ships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 midline warships, 4 escort-class vessels. They picked up the New Haven signal at the Thren relay point, exactly like the simulations predicted. They are moving to intercept. Time to entry point? At their current burn rate, 41 hours. Admiral Cross allowed herself one slow breath. 41 hours. 9 years of planning, and it came down to 41 hours. She turned to the officer beside her, a broad, quiet man named General Marcus Tan, who had been her closest advisor since the beginning of the program they had both come to call, in private, Operation Anvil. They took the bait, she said. They took the bait, Marcus agreed. Now we find out if the rest of it holds together. The New Haven signal had never come from a real colony ship. There was no New Haven. There had never been a New Haven. The signal had been built in a lab by a team of linguists, sound engineers, and psychological warfare specialists who had studied 3 decades of intercepted Krill communications to understand exactly what kind of distress call would draw a Krill patrol fleet in without triggering suspicion. It needed to sound weak. It needed to sound believable. It needed to sound like exactly the kind of easy, profitable little rescue and plunder mission that a proud, overconfident Krill commander would leap at without asking too many questions. They had broadcast 4 versions of the signal into different border regions over the last 6 months, each one slightly different, each one aimed at drawing out a different kind of target. 2 had gone unanswered. 1 had drawn the attention of a group of independent raiders who had been dealt with quietly and without fanfare. And now, finally, the 4th signal had done exactly what it was built to do. It had drawn a real Krill war fleet, 8 ships strong, directly toward the one place in known space that humanity had spent 9 years turning into the most heavily defended trap ever built by any species in galactic history. The Sol system, home. Bring the defense grid to standby, Admiral Cross said. Quiet standby. I don't want a single extra watt of power showing on their sensors that shouldn't be there. Let them see exactly what we want them to see. And what do we want them to see? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. He had helped write the plan himself. We want them to see an easy war, Elena Cross said. The same easy war they remember from 40 years ago. We want them to see a soft, unprepared, frightened little species that never really recovered from the first correction. We want them to fly all the way to Earth orbit, thinking they're about to collect an easy prize. She looked back at the monitor, at the small cluster of dots representing 8 Krill warships, moving steadily closer with every passing hour, utterly unaware of what they were flying into. And then, she said quietly, we show them what we actually built while they weren't looking. Humanity's defeat in the first correction war had never really been forgotten. It could not be forgotten. Not by the generation that lived through it, and not by the generations that came after, who grew up hearing about it in school, in documentaries, in the quiet, bitter stories their grandparents told. It had been a short war, painfully short. Humanity, barely a century into interstellar travel, flush with the confidence of a species that had just begun colonizing its first extrasolar worlds, had run headlong into a Krill border patrol near a mining colony called Vesta's Reach. The clash had been small at first, a misunderstanding over territorial boundaries that nobody on either side had properly mapped. But it escalated fast. The Krill Empire, already centuries old and battle-hardened from a dozen wars against other species, had responded to what it saw as human aggression, with brutal, overwhelming force. 3 human battle groups had been sent to defend the colonies along the border. All 3 had been destroyed, or forced to retreat within 4 months. Vesta's Reach fell. 2 other human colonies fell with it. Humanity's young interstellar navy, built on optimism and untested doctrine, had been humiliated in front of the entire galaxy. The peace treaty that followed was not kind. Humanity ceded 3 border systems, paid tribute in rare materials for a decade, and agreed to strict limits on military shipbuilding along the frontier. The Krill Empire, satisfied that the upstart species had been properly put in its place, moved on to other concerns, other borders, other conquests. Humanity was filed away in Krill records as a minor, defeated species, not worth much further attention. That should have been the end of the story. For most species that suffered a defeat like that, it was. But humanity did not forget, and more importantly, humanity did not stop. In public, on the diplomatic stage, humanity played the part the Krill expected, cautious, humbled, focused on rebuilding shattered colonies and grieving lost soldiers. Human ambassadors spoke softly at galactic councils. Human trade ships avoided contested space. To any outside observer, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like, a wounded species licking its wounds, unlikely to cause trouble again. In private, in facilities buried deep under mountains and hidden beneath ocean floors, something else was happening. The defeat had taught humanity a brutal lesson about its own weaknesses, and unlike so many proud species before it, humanity had actually listened to that lesson. Military doctrine was torn apart and rebuilt from nothing. Engineers who had grown up watching footage of human ships getting torn apart by Krill weapons spent their entire careers designing systems specifically meant to counter what the Krill had shown them. Every scrap of intelligence gathered about Krill ship design, weapon systems, sensor technology, and fleet tactics was studied obsessively, cross-referenced, picked apart, and used to build something new. It took 9 years to finish the plan that would become Operation Anvil, but the real preparation had been going on for almost 40 years of quiet research, 40 years of shipyards built in secret, hidden inside asteroid fields and behind the glare of the sun, where no long-range Krill sensor sweep would ever think to look. 40 years of weapons programs that never once leaked a headline, never once showed up in a trade negotiation, never once gave the Krill Empire any reason to think humanity was anything other than the same defeated, harmless species it had crushed decades before. Admiral Elena Cross had not been born yet when the First Correction War ended. Her grandfather had fought in it, had watched his own ship get gutted by Krill plasma cannons near Vesta's Reach, had survived only because an escape pod malfunction accidentally launched him clear of the wreckage before the final hit. He had told her the story exactly once, when she was 12 years old, sitting on the porch of their home outside what used to be called Denver. They didn't hate us, he had told her. That's the thing people don't understand. They didn't even think about us enough to hate us. We were just in the way. A small problem to be solved and forgotten. She had never forgotten those words. Not during flight school, not during her first deployment along the quiet, watchful border that humanity maintained with the Krill Empire. Not during the 11 years she spent helping design and oversee the construction of Operation Anvil. Being underestimated, she had come to understand, could be the most powerful weapon a species ever built. You just had to be patient enough and disciplined enough to let your enemy keep underestimating you for as long as it took. 41 hours became 38. 38 became 20. Aboard the Ashwin Talon, Fleet Commander Thal Voss studied the long-range scans of the Sol system as his fleet closed the distance, and what he saw only confirmed everything he already believed about humans. The scans showed a scattered scientific outpost near the fourth planet, unshielded and lightly staffed. They showed a scattering of civilian trade vessels moving along predictable, undefended routes. They showed a small orbital shipyard near the third planet, the human homeworld itself, with only a handful of aging warships docked, and no visible active fleet in position to intercept. It looked exactly like what a Krill officer would expect from a defeated, complacent species that had spent 40 years growing soft and comfortable behind old peace treaties. There were no large fleet formations, no aggressive patrol patterns, no hidden weapons platforms that any of his sensor operators could detect, not that Thal Voss expected humans, of all species, to have developed sensor masking technology sophisticated enough to fool a Krill cruiser. It is as I said, Thal Voss told his bridge crew, watching the data scroll past with something close to satisfaction. They have not changed. Whatever attacked their colony ship, it was not the humans defending themselves properly. There is nothing here capable of that. Dornkale, still uneasy, studied the scans with a frown. Commander, the human home system defenses seem thin, almost too thin. Should a species with a functioning navy not maintain stronger defenses around its own homeworld, even during peacetime? You give them too much credit, Thal Voss said. Or, perhaps not enough discredit. Humans spent everything they had, building an empire beyond their means, and the first correction taught them the cost of ambition. They pulled back. They became cautious. Cautious species do not build strong defenses. They build small, affordable ones, and hope no one ever tests them. He straightened, watching the swirl of stars ahead grow slowly brighter as the fleet approached. We will find the source of the New Haven signal. And if there are Krill citizens, or valuable cargo to recover, we will recover them. If it turns out humans attacked their own colony ship in some kind of internal conflict, that is useful information for the Empire as well. Either way, we lose nothing by looking. He did not know, could not know, that every scan his fleet ran was being fed exactly the picture human engineers wanted him to see. The thin defenses, the undefended shipyard, the scattered, harmless-looking trade routes, all of it built, layer by layer, system by system, over 9 years, specifically to be looked at by Krill long-range sensors, and to tell a story of weakness that did not exist. Beneath the visible surface of the Sol system, hidden inside asteroid clusters that had been quietly hollowed out and repurposed, tucked behind sensor-jamming fields disguised as natural solar interference, and buried within the shadow of planets and moons, where no Krill sensor sweep had ever thought to look carefully, the real defense of humanity waited in complete silence. 312 warships, weapon platforms that had never been tested against a live enemy, only against endless simulations run 1,000 times over. An entire generation of human engineers, soldiers, and scientists, all of it built on the bitter lesson of a war fought decades before most of them were even born. And at the center of it all, watching the Krill fleet creep closer on her monitors, hour by hour, Admiral Elena Cross allowed herself, for the first time in 9 years, to feel something close to hope. 20 hours, Marcus Tan said quietly beside her. 20 hours, she repeated. She looked at the fleet icon moving steadily toward the heart of the solar system, following a signal that had never been real, chasing a rescue that had never existed, walking directly into a trap that had taken nearly a lifetime to build. "Wake the fleet," she said, quietly. "It's time." 9 years earlier, when the first designs for Operation Anvil were still nothing more than rough sketches on a whiteboard, in a small, unmarked office outside what used to be Colorado Springs, Elena Cross had been a much younger officer, with a much smaller rank, sitting across the table from a group of skeptical generals who did not believe her plan could ever work. "You want us to build an entire secret fleet," one of the generals had said, not bothering to hide his doubt. "Hide it from every intelligence network in known space, for however many years it takes, and then lure an actual Krill war fleet into a trap using a fake distress signal. Do you have any idea how many things could go wrong with a plan like that?" "Yes, sir," Cross had answered. "I've spent the last 3 years thinking about almost nothing else." She had walked them through it then, the same way she would walk through it 100 more times over the following years, refining the plan each time based on new intelligence, new technology, new lessons learned from careful study of Krill military doctrine. The core idea never changed. Humanity could not outmuscle the Krill Empire through open buildup and confrontation. The moment such an effort became visible, the Empire would either strike preemptively or simply outproduce whatever humanity managed to build, given its centuries of head start. But a slow, patient, invisible buildup, hidden behind careful deception and years of disciplined secrecy, was a different matter entirely. If humanity could not win by being bigger, it could win by being smarter, and by choosing, for the first time in its short interstellar history, exactly when and where a war would be fought. It had taken 2 years simply to convince the Joint Human Command Council to fund the project. It had taken another year after that to select the first generation of engineers, scientists, and officers who would be read into the program, each one vetted more carefully than any human had ever been vetted for anything. Their loyalty and discretion tested again and again before they were allowed to know even the smallest details of what they were building. Dr. Amara Whitfield, the lead propulsion engineer who would go on to design the engine systems that gave human ships their decisive speed advantage, had been among that first generation. She remembered the day Cross had explained the full scope of the project to her, remembered thinking it was the most audacious, most terrifying, most necessary thing she had ever heard proposed. "We're not just building ships," Cross had told her back then. "We're building patience. An entire species has to learn to wait, quietly, for as long as it takes, without ever showing its hand. That's harder than any engineering problem you'll ever solve, Doctor. But it's the only way this works." 9 years later, standing in the command center watching the final hours count down toward first contact, Elena Cross found herself thinking of that conversation, of all the doubts she had faced and pushed through, of every quiet sacrifice made by thousands of people across a decade to keep a single secret intact. It had all been building toward this moment, and now, finally, the moment had come. There was a room, far below the surface of that hidden moon base, that very few people were allowed to enter. It had no official name. The soldiers who worked near it simply called it the archive. Inside, along curved walls lit by soft blue light, hung the preserved records of the First Correction War. Photographs of wrecked human ships drifting silent in the dark. Names of the dead, thousands of them, etched into black glass panels that stretched from floor to ceiling. A recovered helmet, cracked down the middle, that had belonged to a pilot who never made it home. Admiral Cross visited the archive once a year, always alone, always in silence. She had gone there the night before the New Haven signal was first broadcast, 9 months earlier, and she had stood in front of the black glass panels for a long time, reading names she had read 100 times before. She was not a cruel woman. She took no joy in what was about to happen to the 8 Krill ships now closing in on Earth. But she had spent her whole career believing one simple, hard truth. The same truth her grandfather had tried to teach her on that porch outside Denver. A species that could be trampled once, could be trampled again, unless it made absolutely certain that the next time an enemy came looking for an easy war, there would be no easy war left to find. Now, with the Krill fleet, 20 hours from the trap that had taken 9 years to build, she thought of the archive one last time, and then she put it out of her mind. There would be time to remember the dead later. Right now there was work to do, and history, one way or another, was about to be rewritten. The countdown had begun. 20 hours became 12. 12 became 6. Inside the Ashwin Talon, the mood on the bridge had shifted from cautious curiosity to something closer to eagerness. The closer the fleet drew to the human homeworld, the more the sensor readings confirmed what Thalvos had believed from the start. This was not a trap. This was not a resurgent human military waiting to spring a surprise. This was simply a tired, cautious species that had built exactly enough defenses to feel safe, and not one ship more. Resave, still monitoring communications, brought up a new reading. Commander, we are picking up civilian broadcast traffic from the human homeworld. Ordinary chatter, entertainment programming, commercial transmissions, personal messages between family members. Nothing military, nothing encrypted at a level beyond basic civilian standard. As expected, Thalvos said. A species that fears attack does not spend its bandwidth broadcasting entertainment for public enjoyment. They believe themselves safe. Or they want us to believe that, Dorncale muttered, still not fully convinced, though he had learned by now to keep his doubts quiet, unless directly asked. Thalvos heard him anyway. He always did. Dorncale, I understand your caution. It does you credit as an officer. But consider the facts as we have gathered them. Humanity has not built a single new warship class in over a decade, according to every trade report and diplomatic filing we have access to. Their shipyards show minimal activity. Their military budget, as reported to the Galactic Trade Council for tariff purposes, has shrunk steadily for 20 years. A species preparing for war does not shrink its military budget, it grows it. He turned back to the viewport, watching the pale distant star that human records called Sol grow slowly brighter. No. Whatever secret you are afraid we will find here, I do not believe it exists. What we will find is a wounded, cautious people, still afraid of the lesson we taught them the last time we met. He did not know that every one of those trade reports, every diplomatic filing, every whisper of declining military spending that Krill intelligence had gathered over the past 2 decades, had been carefully, patiently constructed by human intelligence agencies working hand in hand with military planners. Numbers had been quietly altered. Real shipyards had been hidden behind false ones, showing only routine maintenance work. Budget reports filed with galactic trade authorities had been doctored just enough to tell a convincing story of a species in slow, steady decline, without ever crossing the line into something so dramatic it might attract closer inspection. It had taken an entire division of analysts 9 years to build that false picture, layer by careful layer, and it had worked exactly as intended. The most dangerous kind of lie, humanity's planners had learned, was not a big dramatic one. It was a small, boring one, repeated patiently over many years, until it simply became accepted as fact. 6 hours from the edge of the Sol system, the Krill fleet crossed an invisible line in space that human sensor operators, watching from their hidden stations, had marked on their tactical displays months in advance. They called it the threshold. In the command center beneath the moon, a young sensor technician named Priya Okafor watched the line light up green on her display and immediately reported it. Fleet has crossed the threshold marker. They are now inside effective range of the outer sensor net. Passive only, Admiral Cross ordered. No active pings. I want them to keep believing what they've been told to believe for just a little longer. The outer sensor net, built from a scattered chain of stealth satellites disguised as harmless space debris and dead communication relays, began quietly tracking every detail of the approaching Krill fleet. Ship classes, weapon loadouts, shield strength, engine signatures. Every scrap of data flowed silently back to the command center, feeding directly into the tactical models that human officers had built and refined over years of simulation. General Marcus Tan studied the readouts with a critical eye. 8 ships, just like the early estimate. 1 heavy cruiser at the center, that's the HFY Talon, matches records from 3 border skirmishes over the last decade. 3 midline warships flanking it. 4 escort-class vessels running perimeter patrol around the formation. He tapped the display, highlighting the heavy cruiser. That's the flagship. If Krill doctrine holds the same as it did 40 years ago, all fleet coordination runs through that ship. Take out its command systems early, and the rest of the fleet loses coherence fast. Their doctrine hasn't changed, Cross asked, though she already suspected the answer. Not from what we're seeing, Marcus said. Formation spacing, escort positioning, even the way they're running their sensor sweeps, it all matches patterns from the first correction war almost exactly. They haven't had to adapt in decades. Nobody's given them a reason to. Cross allowed herself a small, humorless smile. Then we're about to give them one. Not everyone in the command center shared the Admiral's calm confidence. Among the junior officers gathered at their stations, nerves ran high, though discipline kept most of it hidden behind steady hands and quiet voices. Lieutenant Okafor, only 2 years out of the academy, found herself glancing again and again at the tactical display, watching the 8 Krill ships creep steadily closer to the trap she had spent the last 18 months helping to build. Beside her, a slightly older officer named David Reyes noticed her tension and leaned over. First live deployment? First live anything, she admitted quietly. I've run this simulation maybe 200 times. It never felt like this. It never does, Reyes said. Simulations don't have real people flying those ships up there. Doesn't matter how many times you run it. The first time it's real, your body knows the difference, even if your training doesn't want to admit it. Do you think it'll work? She asked. The whole plan, all of it. Reyes considered the question seriously before answering, the way a man does when he has thought about the same question many times himself, and still isn't entirely sure of the answer. I think we've spent 9 years building the best trap anyone has ever built for exactly this kind of enemy. I think the people running this operation are smarter and more careful than almost anyone else in human history has ever been given the chance to be. And I think that fleet up there has no idea what it flew into. He paused. But nothing ever goes exactly the way the simulation says it will. That's just the truth of it. We prepared for that too, as much as anyone can. Okafor nodded slowly, watching the green dots on her screen continue their slow, steady approach. Somewhere out there, real people, or whatever the Krill equivalent of people was, were flying real ships toward a fight they didn't know was coming. It was strange to think about, strange and heavy. Fleet Commander Thal Voss had fought in 11 engagements over his long career, and he had learned to trust his instincts as much as he trusted his sensors. As the HFY Talon drew within 2 hours of the human homeworld, something small and hard to name began to itch at the back of his mind, a feeling he could not quite justify with data, but could not quite dismiss either. He walked the length of the bridge slowly, studying each console in turn, watching his crew work with the calm efficiency he had trained into them over years of service together. Everything looked correct. Everything looked exactly as the sensor data promised it would. And yet, Receve, he said finally. Run a full spectrum sweep of the space around the human homeworld. All frequencies. I want to know if there is anything at all, that does not match the pattern we have already logged. The younger officer complied, running the sweep across visual, infrared, radio, gravimetric, and a dozen other spectrums the HFY Talon's sensor suite was capable of monitoring. The results took several minutes to compile, and when they finally appeared on the main display, They showed exactly what every previous scan had shown. A quiet, modest home system, light civilian traffic, a small, aging shipyard. No sign of a hidden fleet, no unusual energy readings, nothing to suggest the peaceful picture in front of them was anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. Nothing unusual, Commander, Receve reported. The readings are consistent across every sweep. Thalvos studied the display a moment longer, then nodded slowly, though the itch at the back of his mind did not entirely fade. He had been a soldier long enough to know that instinct sometimes lied, shaped by old fears and old battles that had nothing to do with the situation in front of him now. Perhaps that was all this was, the ghost of a war 40 years gone, whispering caution into the mind of an officer who had learned the hard way what happened when you underestimated an enemy. Except, of course, this was not that lesson at all. This was the opposite of it. And the terrible irony, one that Thalvos would not understand until it was far too late, was that his instincts were not warning him about underestimating a dangerous enemy from the past. They were failing to warn him strongly enough about underestimating a very different enemy, one that had spent 40 years turning its old weakness into something the galaxy had never seen before. "Continue on course," he said at last, "but keep full sensors active. If there is something out there, I want to know the moment we find it." Back on the hidden moon base, the final hours before contact passed in careful, disciplined silence. Ship crews across the 312 vessels of the true human fleet, tucked away inside asteroid clusters and behind sensor-jamming fields scattered throughout the outer solar system, received their final orders and moved quietly into position, engines running at the lowest possible power to avoid detection. Admiral Cross moved through the command center, stopping briefly at each station to offer a quiet word of confidence to the officers under her command. It was a habit she had built over years of leadership, not because she believed a few kind words could change the outcome of a battle, but because she believed, deeply and completely, that people performed better when they knew their commander trusted them. At the tactical station, she paused beside General Tan, who was reviewing the final positioning report one last time. "Everyone's in place," Tan confirmed. "First Fleet is holding position behind the asteroid cluster near the fourth planet, exactly where the simulations put them. Second and third fleets are staged along the flanking approach vectors. The mobile platforms near the shipyard are running full stealth protocols. Nothing on their scopes should show anything beyond what we've already let them see." "And the shipyard itself?" "Fully prepped. The moment the order comes, those aging warships they've been watching sit idle in dock for the last 3 months are going to come online a lot faster than anyone expects." Tan allowed himself a small, tight smile. "We've been running this exact deception since before some of the crew flying those ships were even born, Admiral. If there's one thing this operation has, it's patience." Cross nodded, watching the tactical display where the Krill fleet, still unaware, continued its slow approach to. She thought again of her grandfather, of the story he had told her only once, of watching his ship torn apart by an enemy that never even bothered to hate him, an enemy that simply saw humanity as a small problem to be solved and forgotten. "They filed us away," she said quietly, almost to herself. 40 years ago, they filed humanity away as finished, as beaten, as a footnote in their history books. She turned to face the tactical display fully. Let's remind them why that was a mistake. 1 hour from the edge of what Krill sensors identified as the human homeworld's defensive perimeter, the fleet slowed its approach, moving now at a cautious, measured pace, befitting a commander who, whatever his confidence, was not a fool. Thalvos stood at the center of the bridge, watching the pale blue-white world grow larger on the main view screen, its single moon trailing quietly behind it, its orbital space dotted with the scattered traffic of ordinary civilian life. "Bring us within communication range of the shipyard," he ordered. "If humans still remember the terms of our last treaty, they will know better than to interfere with a Krill vessel making peaceful contact. We will demand information about the New Haven signal, and we will see how they respond." "And if they refuse to cooperate?" Dorn Kale asked. Thalvos allowed himself a small, confident smile, the same smile that had carried him through 11 engagements and 40 years of a peace built on humanity's old defeat. "Then we will remind them why they signed that treaty in the first place." The fleet moved forward, 8 ships strong, sensors sweeping a picture of quiet, undefended calm, following a signal that had never been real, sailing steadily and confidently into the center of the most carefully built trap in human history. Behind the asteroid clusters, behind the sensor-jamming fields, inside the shipyard that had spent months pretending to hold nothing but old, tired ships, 312 human warships waited in silence, engines idling, weapons armed, crews standing ready at their stations. The countdown reached its final hour. Aboard the human warship Resolute, tucked into a hollow carved from the heart of a small asteroid nearly 100 years before it ever imagined being used for war, Captain Daniel Okoye stood on his bridge and watched the same tactical feed that every other human ship in the system was watching. He had trained for this moment for 6 years, ever since he was pulled from a standard patrol assignment and quietly reassigned to a project he was told, at first, almost nothing about. Only later, once his clearance had been raised high enough, did anyone explain to him what Operation Anvil actually was. He remembered that first briefing clearly. A gray-haired engineer, named Dr. Amara Whitfield, had stood in front of a room full of newly selected officers and told them, plainly, what they were about to become part of. "You have all fought under the shadow of the First Correction War, your entire lives," she had said. Every one of you grew up hearing that story, whether from your grandparents, your textbooks, or the quiet way people still flinch when they hear the word krill. What you are about to help build is not revenge. It is not aggression. It is the answer to a question that has haunted this species for 40 years. What happens the next time someone comes looking for an easy war? We intend to make sure the answer is very simple. There will be no easy war left to find. Okoye had carried those words with him through 6 years of training, simulation, and quiet, patient waiting. Now, watching the krill fleet finalize its approach on his tactical display, he found himself thinking of his grandmother, who had lost her older brother during the First Correction War, a young pilot barely out of flight school, whose ship had been torn apart somewhere near Vesta's reach. She had told him stories about her brother when he was young, about how proud he had been to join the fleet, how certain everyone had been that humanity's first real war among the stars would end in victory rather than humiliation. "Bridge, this is engineering." A voice crackled over the comm. "All systems reading green. Weapons fully charged. We are ready whenever the order comes." "Copy that," Okoye said. "Hold position and hold your nerve. We've trained for this. Now we just have to do it." Around him, his crew worked in focused, disciplined silence, each one carrying their own private version of the same history that had brought them all to this moment. Some had lost family members in the old war. Others had simply grown up in a culture shaped entirely by the memory of that defeat. A culture that had quietly decided, generation after generation, that it would never again be caught unprepared. Not far away, aboard the flagship of Second Fleet, a very different kind of preparation was taking place. Commodore Sarah Lynn, who had helped design the flanking maneuver that would seal off the krill fleet's escape route toward the jump point, walked the corridors of her ship one final time before battle stations were called, checking in personally with as many of her crew as she could reach. She stopped at the medical bay, where a young medic named Corporal James Whitlock was double-checking his emergency supplies for what felt like the 10th time that hour. "Nervous?" Lynn asked, leaning against the doorway. "A little, Commodore," Whitlock admitted. "I keep running through the numbers. 8 ships against 312. It doesn't feel like it should be this close a call, even with all the planning." Lynn considered this for a moment. "It won't be close," she said. "Not in the way you're thinking. But that doesn't mean it'll be simple. Even a fleet that size can do real damage if they fight smart. And from what the intelligence reports tell us, their commander has fought real wars before. He'll fight smart. Our job is to make sure smart isn't enough." She straightened, offering the young medic a brief, reassuring nod. "Get your supplies ready anyway. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That's how we got here in the first place." She left him to his work and continued down the corridor, her mind turning over the same tactical questions she had wrestled with for the better part of 2 years, while helping design this exact maneuver. 9 years of preparation across an entire species was an extraordinary thing, but she understood, perhaps better than most, that no plan survived contact with reality perfectly intact. There would be surprises, there always were. The question was only whether the plan was strong enough and flexible enough to absorb whatever surprises came. With less than 30 minutes remaining before the Krill fleet would cross the final threshold into contact range, Admiral Cross gathered her senior staff for one last briefing in the command center. She looked around the room at the faces of the people who had helped her build Operation Anvil from nothing, some of whom had been with the project since its very first year, others who had joined more recently, but had thrown themselves into the work with the same quiet dedication. "In a few minutes," she said, "everything we have built is going to be tested for the first time against a real enemy, not a simulation. I want to say something before that happens, because I don't know if there will be time afterward." She paused, choosing her words carefully. 9 years ago, when this project began, a lot of people told us it was too ambitious, too expensive, too slow. They said no species could keep a secret of this size for that long, without someone talking, without some enemy agent slipping through, without some mistake giving the whole plan away. She looked around the room again. You proved them wrong. Every one of you, in your own way, helped keep that secret and helped build something this species has never had before, the ability to choose the terms of a fight, instead of simply reacting to one forced upon us. She let the words settle for a moment before continuing. Whatever happens in the next few hours, I want you to remember that this was never about revenge. It was never about proving we're better than anyone else. It was about making sure that the next time someone looks at humanity and sees an easy target, they're wrong. That's all. That's the whole reason any of this exists. She glanced at the tactical display, where the Krill fleet continued its slow, unknowing approach. Let's finish what we started. The staff dispersed to their stations, and the command center settled into the tense, focused quiet that comes before any great undertaking, human or otherwise. Outside, in the cold dark of space, 8 Krill warships continued toward the center of a trap 9 years in the making, utterly unaware that every scrap of data on their sensors had been carefully, patiently designed to lead them exactly here. The countdown reached its final hour. The Krill fleet crossed into what its sensors labeled the human home defensive perimeter, at exactly the hour Admiral Cross's staff had predicted, down to the minute. It was the kind of precision that came only from 9 years of study, simulation, and patience, and as the 8 ships settled into a loose formation just beyond the orbit of the human homeworld's shipyard, nobody aboard those ships had any idea they were now sitting in the exact center of a trap built specifically for this moment. Thalvas stood at the command console, watching as Resave opened a communication channel toward the shipyard. "This is Fleet Commander Thalvas, of the Krill vessel Ashwin Talon," she transmitted, using the old formal diplomatic protocol established after the First Correction War. "We are investigating a distress signal traced to this region of space, believed to have originated from a human colony vessel called New Haven. We request information regarding this signal and the fate of its passengers." The response took nearly 2 full minutes to arrive, long enough that Dorn Kale began to shift uneasily at his station, watching the silent view screen. When the reply finally came, it was a human voice, calm, professional, carrying none of the fear or urgency Thalvas might have expected from a species he believed still lived in the shadow of its old defeat. "Krill vessel Ashwin Talon, this is Earth Orbital Traffic Control. We have no record of a colony vessel named New Haven registered under any human authority. Please hold position while we confirm your diplomatic status under the Vesta Accords." Thalvas frowned slightly at the delay, but said nothing. It was, after all, exactly the kind of cautious, procedural response he would expect from a species trying to appear orderly and unthreatening. He gestured for Resave to hold the channel open and waited. What he did not know, what none of the 8 ships in his fleet had any way of knowing, was that the delay was not procedural at all. It was the final countdown of Operation Anvil, running its last sequence exactly on schedule, giving 312 human warships the last few minutes they needed to complete their final positioning around the unsuspecting Krill fleet. In the command center beneath the moon, Admiral Cross watched the tactical display with total stillness, her hands folded behind her back, her eyes fixed on the 8 glowing icons representing the Krill fleet, now sitting almost perfectly at the center of the trap. "All fleets report positioned and ready," General Tan said quietly beside her. "First Fleet is holding behind the asteroid cluster, weapons hot. Second and Third Fleets have completed their flanking maneuver and are holding along the intercept vectors. The shipyard defense platforms are fully online and disguised as inactive. Every ship in position, Admiral. We are ready on your order." Cross studied the display a moment longer. 8 small icons, surrounded on every side by hundreds of hidden ships they could not see. Weapon systems they had no idea existed. Defenses built specifically, patiently, and quietly, to counter every advantage the Krill Empire had used to crush humanity 40 years earlier. She thought, briefly, of the black glass panels in the archive, of the thousands of names etched into them, of her grandfather's voice on that porch outside Denver so many years ago. They didn't hate us. That's the thing people don't understand. They didn't even think about us enough to hate us. Open a channel to the Krill flagship, she said. I want them to hear this from me directly. Aboard the Ashwin Talon, Resave looked up sharply from her console. Commander, incoming transmission. Priority channel, directly from the human homeworld. It is not routing through the shipyard traffic control. It is coming from, I cannot identify the origin point precisely. The signal is masking its source. Thalvoss's earlier unease returned, sharper now. Put it through. The bridge fell silent as the transmission connected, and a woman's voice, calm and clear, filled the space between the stars. Fleet Commander Thalvoss, of the Krill vessel Ashwin Talon, Admiral Elena Cross said, her voice carrying no anger, no fear, only a quiet and terrible certainty. My name is Fleet Admiral Elena Cross, of the Human Defense Fleet. I want you to know, before anything else happens, that the New Haven signal you followed here was never real. There was no colony ship. There were no survivors to rescue. It was built specifically to bring a Krill patrol fleet into this system, and it worked exactly as intended. On the bridge of the Ashwin Talon, every officer froze. Dorn Kale's hand hovered over his weapons console. Resave stared at her screen, searching desperately for the source of the transmission, and finding nothing. Thalvoss stood perfectly still, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just heard, arriving at a conclusion his instincts had been quietly warning him about for the last several hours. You are currently sitting at the center of a defensive formation built over the last 9 years, Cross continued. 312 warships surround your fleet right now, holding position, weapons ready. I am telling you this not to frighten you, but because I believe you deserve the chance to understand exactly what has happened before it happens. 40 years ago, your empire taught my species a very hard lesson about what happens to those who are unprepared. We have spent every year since studying that lesson. I do not say this with hatred, Commander. I say it because it is true, and because I believe a commander should know the shape of the battle he is standing in, before the first shot is fired. Thalvoss's jaw tightened. Around him, alarm klaxons began sounding as his own sensor operators, scrambling now to run the deep scans they should have run hours earlier, finally began picking up faint traces of what had been hidden from them all along. The ghost edges of hundreds of ships, powering up in careful, coordinated sequence, emerging from behind asteroid fields and sensor-jamming clouds on every side of the Krill formation. Impossible, Dorn Kale whispered, staring at his readouts as the numbers climbed. That is not possible. Our scans showed nothing. Nothing. They showed you exactly what we wanted you to see, Cross said, her voice steady over the open channel. That was the point. Thalvoss's mind moved fast, decades of combat experience overriding the shock that threatened to freeze him in place. He had been ambushed before, though never on this scale, never by an enemy his own intelligence reports had assured him was too weak to attempt such a thing. But shock was a luxury he could not afford, not with 8 ships and their crews depending on his next decision. Full defensive formation. Now, he barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic on the bridge. Shields to maximum. Weapons hot on all vessels. Signal the fleet. Prepare for immediate withdrawal to the jump point. Commander, Resave said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. The jump point is behind their formation. We are surrounded on every vector. There is no clear path to withdraw. Thalvoss studied the tactical display, watching the ghost shapes of the human fleet continue to resolve into hard, confirmed contacts. Ship after ship after ship, emerging from hiding places that should not have existed, could not have existed, according to everything Krill intelligence had told him about this system. 312 ships, against his 8. He had commanded fleets into battles with worse odds, before, in his younger years, and had come out victorious through skill, discipline, and the simple, brutal fact that Krill ship technology had always outclassed anything a lesser species could build. But even as he ran the numbers, Some old soldier's instinct at the back of his mind whispered a warning he did not want to hear. A species patient enough to hide 300 ships for 9 years. Patient enough to build an elaborate false signal and wait for the right target to take the bait, was not a species that would have stopped at simply matching krill numbers. They would have built something better. All ships, tightest possible defensive formation, he ordered. Concentrate fire arcs toward the strongest concentration of enemy vessels. If we can break one section of their line, we create a path to the jump point. The order went out across the fleet, and the 8 krill ships drew together into a hard, disciplined defensive sphere, weapons charging, shields at full strength, crews bracing for a fight that every officer aboard now understood they had never truly been prepared for. In the command center beneath the moon, Admiral Cross watched the krill fleet pull into its defensive formation and felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only the calm, focused clarity of a commander watching a plan she had spent 9 years building finally reach the moment of execution. "They're forming up," Tan reported, trying to concentrate their fire arc toward the southern flank, probably hoping to punch through toward the jump point. "Let them try," Cross said quietly. "It won't matter." She turned to the fleet-wide communication officer standing at attention nearby. "Signal all fleets. Weapons free the moment they open fire, not before. I gave them the chance to understand what they were facing. Whatever happens next is their choice to make." The order rippled outward across 312 ships, hidden no longer, now fully visible on every krill sensor screen, closing slowly and deliberately around the small, tight formation of 8 desperate krill warships at the center of the trap. On the bridge of the Ashwind Talon, Thal Voss watched the human fleet finish its encirclement, watched the tactical display fill with more hostile contacts than he had ever faced in 11 engagements combined, and understood, with the cold clarity of a soldier who had spent his life studying war, that whatever happened in the next few minutes was going to change everything he thought he knew about the species his empire had once dismissed as beaten. "All weapons," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "Target the nearest concentration. On my mark." Around him, his crew braced for the fight of their lives, unaware that the fight had already been decided 9 years before it began. Fire. In the moments before that order rang out across the Ashwind Talon, a very different scene was unfolding aboard one of the 4 escort vessels holding position at the edge of the krill formation. A smaller ship, called the Renix Hope, commanded by a junior officer named Vestarn, who had never before fought in a real engagement. Vestarn had joined the krill military only 6 years earlier, drawn by stories of the Empire's long and unbroken record of victory, stories that made war sound like something clean and certain, something that happened to other people while the Empire's ships simply did what they had always done. He had never fought in the First Correction War. He had never seen a krill fleet lose. He had grown up entirely inside the comfortable certainty that his species was simply, naturally superior to whatever lesser life it encountered among the stars. Now, watching his own sensor display fill with more hostile contacts than he had known existed in human hands, he felt something he had never felt before in his short career: real, cold fear. "Helm," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady in front of his small crew. "Hold position. Tight formation with the flagship. Weapons officer. Target the nearest cluster on my mark." His weapons officer, an older enlisted krill named Dressa, glanced at him, with something between sympathy and grim resolve. "Sir, our sensors are barely tracking a fraction of what's out there. We are heavily outnumbered." "I am aware," Vestarn said quietly. "Hold position anyway. We follow the commander's orders." When Thal Voss's order to fire finally came, the Renix Hope joined the rest of the fleet in that first, desperate volley, weapons blazing toward the nearest human formation. Vestarn watched the readouts with something close to disbelief, as the human shields absorbed the strike without visible damage, and in that moment, watching his ship's best effort simply vanish against an enemy defense system his own intelligence briefings had assured him could not exist, he understood, with sudden and total clarity, that everything he had believed about his species and its place in the galaxy had been built on assumptions that were no longer true. The battle that followed unfolded across the dark space surrounding the human homeworld, in patterns that would later be studied by military academies across dozens of species for generations to come. 312 human ships, moving with a coordination built from thousands of hours of simulation and years of quiet drilling, closed around the Krill formation in a slow, deliberate tightening, each vessel holding its assigned position with the discipline of a species that had spent 9 years rehearsing this exact moment. Aboard the Ashwind Talon, Thal Voss watched his own return fire strike against the nearest human vessels, and felt a brief, fierce satisfaction as one small human escort ship, caught at an unlucky angle, took a solid hit and staggered out of formation, its shields flaring dangerously before stabilizing. "We drew blood, Commander," Dornkale reported, some of his earlier fear giving way to the focus of a trained officer doing his job under fire. "Enemy vessel designation Hunter 12, shields at 40% and falling." "Concentrate fire on that same vessel," Thal Voss ordered immediately, seeing an opportunity and moving to press it the way any experienced commander would. "If we can break even one of their ships, it may create an opening." But even as the order went out, more human vessels shifted smoothly to cover the weakened Hunter 12, closing ranks with a speed and precision that made clear this was not a formation caught off guard, but one that had rehearsed exactly this kind of situation many times before. Within moments, Hunter 12 had withdrawn safely behind a screen of fresh ships, its shields already beginning to recharge, while the human vessels that had moved to cover it turned their own weapons back toward the Krill formation with devastating effect. "They adapt too fast," Resave said, her voice tight with growing alarm, as she watched the tactical display. "Every opening we find, they close within seconds." Not every part of the battle went entirely as smoothly as Admiral Cross's staff had planned, however. Aboard the human cruiser Meridian, part of the formation covering the northern flank of the encirclement, Captain Elena Vasquez watched with growing concern as a coordinated Krill strike found an unexpected gap between two of her escort vessels, a gap created by a communications delay of less than 2 seconds that nonetheless proved just enough for a Krill midline warship to slip a heavy volley through. The strike hit the Meridian directly, staggering the ship and sending a shudder through every deck. Alarms blared across the bridge as damage reports began flooding in. "Shields down to 60% on the forward arc," her tactical officer reported. "We took real damage there, Captain. That wasn't supposed to get through." "No plan survives contact perfectly," Vasquez said, echoing words she had heard from her instructors many times during training. "Close the gap, now. Signal the Halcyon to shift position and cover our flank." The correction came quickly, human ships adjusting their formation in real time to seal the breach that had briefly opened. But the moment served as a sharp reminder, both to the crew of the Meridian and to the officers watching from the command center beneath the moon, that even 9 years of careful planning could not account for every variable in a battle this large and this complex. The plan was strong, it was not perfect, and everyone involved understood, in that brief, tense moment, exactly how much could still go wrong if discipline slipped even slightly. Admiral Cross, watching the exchange from the command center, felt her jaw tighten as the damage report came through, but she said nothing beyond a brief acknowledgement, trusting the training she had spent years building into every officer under her command. "Formation held," she said quietly to General Tan beside her, watching the gap close on the tactical display. "That's what matters. We built room for mistakes into this plan. Now we find out if that room was big enough." "It was," Tan said, watching the Meridian stabilize and rejoin the tightening formation around the Krill fleet. "It is." Back aboard the Ashwind Talon, Thal Voss watched the brief opening at the human formation's northern flank close almost as quickly as it had appeared, and felt the last of his hope for a clean breakout fade away entirely. He had commanded fleets long enough to recognize the signs of an enemy that had trained for exactly this scenario, that had planned not just for victory, but for the small, inevitable mistakes that came with any large-scale engagement, and had built enough flexibility into its formation to absorb those mistakes without losing control of the battle. "Status report," he said, forcing his voice to remain calm, even as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. "Escort 1 and Escort 3 destroyed," Resave reported, her voice barely holding steady. "Midline warship Ferrex Pride has broken formation, attempting independent withdrawal. Escort 2, critical damage, engines offline, drifting." The Voss closed his eyes for the briefest moment, a lifetime of battles and victories crashing against the reality unfolding around him. Then he opened them again and turned to face his remaining crew, the officers who had trusted his judgment to bring them safely through whatever this mission required. "Hold formation," he said. "We are not finished yet." Around him, the Ashwin Talon shuddered under another wave of human weapons fire, its shields straining against a force it had never been designed to withstand, while 300 human warships continued their slow, disciplined, and utterly relentless advance. Aboard the crippled escort ship drifting at the edge of the battle, its engines dead and its weapons silent, Vestarn sat in the dim emergency lighting of his damaged bridge and watched the numbers on his one remaining functional display tick down, along with his ship's dwindling power reserves. Around him, his small crew worked quietly to keep life support running, no longer able to contribute anything to the battle raging beyond their hull. "Sir," Dressa said quietly, checking the last of the readouts available to them, "we still have an emergency beacon. If we signal surrender, there is a chance the humans will take us in, rather than finish us off." Vestarn considered this for a long moment, watching through a cracked viewport as human ships moved past his drifting vessel, without bothering to deliver a final blow, focused instead on the larger battle still unfolding around the Ashwin Talon and the remaining Krill ships. It struck him, in that strange, quiet moment, that the humans could have destroyed his crippled ship easily, and had simply chosen not to. "Send the signal," he said finally. "There is no dishonor in surviving to tell others what we saw here today." The beacon went out, a simple, old distress code recognized across most of known space, and within minutes, a human vessel drew alongside, weapons powered down, extending what Vestarn could only describe, once he had time to think about it properly, as mercy. The tide of the battle continued to shift, with a speed that left even the most experienced Krill officers struggling to process what was happening. Thalvos watched his tactical display with the grim focus of a commander no longer fighting for victory, but for the survival of as many of his people as possible, weighing every decision now, not against the question of how to win, but against the question of how to preserve what remained of his fleet and its crews. "Commander," Resave said, her voice hoarse from hours of strain, "the midline warship, Senec's Wrath, has taken critical damage. Life support failing on 3 decks. They are requesting immediate evacuation assistance, but we have no ships free to send." Thalvos looked at the tactical display, at the human formation still holding its patient, disciplined encirclement, weapons trained but not firing on the stricken Senec's Wrath, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, exactly what he needed to do. "Signal the human fleet," he said. "Tell them we request permission for the Senec's Wrath crew to evacuate under a flag of truce, and that if they grant it, we will consider the terms of a broader surrender." The response came quickly, relayed through the same calm, steady voice that had first spoken to him hours earlier. "Permission granted, Fleet Commander. Evacuation will not be interfered with. We await your fleet's decision." Thalvos watched as human ships drew back just enough to allow emergency shuttles from the Senec's Wrath to escape into the waiting arms of a nearby human cruiser, watched as wounded Krill crew members were received without hostility by an enemy that, by every measure he understood, had every right and every capability to simply let them die. It was, in its own strange way, a piece of evidence he had not expected, and it sat uneasily alongside everything else the battle had taught him in the last few hours. Still, an old soldier's stubbornness held him back from the final decision, at least for a little while longer. Pride, duty, and the faint fading hope that some path back to the jump point might yet open, kept his hand away from the final order, even as his ship shuddered under another strike, and the numbers on every damage report continued to climb. "Hold formation," he said again, though his voice carried less certainty now than it had at the start of the engagement. "We are not finished yet." On the tactical display, the human fleet continued its slow, patient tightening, weapons ready, discipline unbroken, giving no sign of hurry, no sign of doubt. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, Thalvos understood, would decide not only the fate of his remaining crew, but the answer to a question his entire empire would soon be forced to reckon with. The first Krill volley lit up the darkness of the Sol system like a string of small, angry stars, plasma cannons firing in a tight, coordinated pattern toward the nearest cluster of human ships along the southern flank. It was a good shot, disciplined and well-aimed, the kind of opening strike that had shattered human formations 40 years earlier during the First Correction War. It did almost nothing. The human ships in that section of the formation, a squadron of vessels humanity's engineers had spent years designing specifically to counter Krill plasma weaponry, absorbed the impact against layered shields built from technology no Krill scan had ever detected. The shields flared bright, held, and did not break. On the bridge of the Ashwin Talon, Dorn Kale stared at the tactical readout in disbelief. "Commander, shield penetration, 0%. Their shields absorbed the full force of the volley without any measurable damage." Thal Voss felt something cold settle into his chest, a feeling he had not experienced since his earliest days as a junior officer, decades ago, before he had learned to trust his own skill in battle. Impossible. No shield technology should be able to fully absorb a coordinated plasma volley at that range. "Reading it again, Commander," Resave said, her voice tight. "The result is the same. Their shields are stronger than anything in our database, stronger than anything we have ever encountered from any species." Before Thal Voss could respond, the human fleet answered. Admiral Cross watched the exchange from the command center with the same steady focus she had held throughout the entire operation. "Their shot didn't get through," she confirmed as the reports came in. "Return fire, southern flank first. Show them what 9 years bought us." 312 human warships opened fire, in a rolling, coordinated pattern. Weapon systems built from decades of research, aimed at one single, specific target. The exact shield frequencies, hull compositions, and weapon patterns of the Krill Empire. Every human weapon fired that day had been designed with the enemy already in mind, tuned and refined across thousands of simulations to punch through Krill defenses as efficiently as possible. The results were immediate and devastating. One of the 4 Krill escort ships, caught at the edge of the defensive formation, took a direct hit from 3 separate human vessels simultaneously. Its shields flared, strained, and collapsed within seconds. The follow-up strike tore through its hull, and the ship broke apart in a silent, terrible flash of light, debris scattering outward into the dark. On the Ashwin Talon, alarms blared across every station as the crew watched their fleet, so recently confident and secure, suddenly begin taking losses at a speed no Krill officer had ever experienced. "Escort 3 is gone," Resave reported, her voice shaking now despite her training. "No survivors detected." Thal Voss forced himself to remain still, forced his voice to remain level, even as everything he understood about warfare was being torn apart in front of him. "Concentrate defensive fire. Protect the remaining escorts. We need to hold the formation long enough to find a path to the jump point." The battle that followed was unlike anything either species had fought before. Humanity's ships, though smaller on average than the heavy Krill cruiser at the center of the formation, moved with a speed and precision that came from technology, decades ahead of anything the Krill Empire had encountered in its long history of conquest. Engines built on principles humanity had developed in secret, away from any prying eyes, allowed human vessels to shift position far faster than Krill targeting systems could track. Weapon systems, tuned specifically to exploit weaknesses in Krill shield harmonics, punched through defenses that had never failed against any other enemy the Empire had faced. Dornkale's console lit up with a new alert. "Commander, one of the midline warships, the Ferrex Pride, is requesting permission to break formation and attempt a breakout toward the jump point." "Denied," Thal Voss said sharply. "A single ship alone will not survive the crossing. We hold together, or we do not survive at all." But even as he spoke, he watched his tactical display fill with red markers, human ships closing from every angle, weapons fire crisscrossing the battle space in patterns too complex and too fast for his own gunners to fully track. The Ashwin Talon itself took its first direct hit moments later, a concentrated strike from 2 human cruisers that staggered the great ship and sent showers of sparks cascading down from an overhead conduit near the bridge. "Shields at 71%, Resave called out, bracing herself against her console. "Hull integrity holding, but Commander, at this rate of fire, we will not last long." Thal Voss gripped the edge of his command console, watching the battle unfold with the sick, dawning understanding of a man witnessing the complete collapse of everything he had believed about his enemy. 40 years ago, Krill ships had swept through human formations with almost contemptuous ease. Now, humanity's ships moved and fought with a discipline, a precision, and a raw technological advantage that made the memory of that old, easy victory feel like something from an entirely different war, fought by an entirely different species. In the command center beneath the moon, the reports came in steadily, each one confirming what 9 years of planning had promised. Escort 4 destroyed, an officer called out. Escort 2, critical damage, drifting, weapons offline. Midline warship Ferrix Pride has broken formation, another reported. Attempting independent breakout toward the northeast vector. Admiral Cross studied the display without emotion, though something tight and quiet sat behind her eyes, the weight of every life being lost on both sides of this battle. She had spent 9 years preparing to fight. Second Fleet, intercept the breakout attempt, disable if possible. I don't want unnecessary casualties if it can be avoided. Disable, not destroy? Tan asked, glancing at her. We built this trap to end a threat, not to slaughter every soul caught inside it, Cross said quietly. If they surrender, we accept it. If they run, we let them go, once they're no longer a danger to Earth. This was never meant to be a massacre, Marcus. It was meant to be a message. The order went out, and Second Fleet moved to intercept the fleeing Ferrix Pride, human ships closing around it with practiced precision, disabling its engines and weapons systems with focused, controlled strikes, rather than the killing blow they were more than capable of delivering. Aboard the crippled warship, its remaining crew, staring at the overwhelming force surrounding them, made the only choice that made sense. Weapons powered down, a surrender signal, broadcast on old emergency frequencies, crackled across the battle space. Back on the Ashwin Talon, Thalvos watched the surrender of the Ferrix Pride on his tactical display, and felt the last of his old certainty crumble away entirely. 2 escorts destroyed, 1 more crippled and drifting. Now a full warship surrendered, without even the dignity of a final stand. Commander, Resave said quietly. Orders? Thalvos studied the battle space, 300 human ships still tightening their formation around what remained of his fleet, weapons fire slowing now, not because the humans lacked the strength to finish the job, but because, he began to realize with a strange and bitter clarity, they were choosing not to. They are not trying to destroy us, he said slowly, almost to himself. Not entirely. Commander? Dornkale asked, confused. Look at the pattern, Thalvos said, studying the tactical display more closely now. Their strongest strikes have targeted our weapons and engines, not our life support or crew compartments. They disabled the Ferrix Pride rather than destroying it outright. They have the strength to annihilate this entire fleet in minutes, and yet they have not done so. He turned to face his remaining bridge crew, the weight of the realization settling over him. They are giving us the chance to surrender. The bridge fell silent, save for the low hum of damaged systems and the distant tremor of weapons fire still striking against the Ashwin Talon's straining shields. Thalvos thought of the message Admiral Cross had sent before the battle began. I do not say this with hatred, Commander. I say it because it is true. He thought of 40 years of Krill history books calling humanity a defeated, forgotten species, a footnote not worth further attention. He thought of 11 engagements fought and won across his long career, and how none of them had prepared him for an enemy who could dismantle his fleet in minutes and still choose restraint over total destruction. Shields at 43%, Resave reported, her voice tight with the strain of holding steady under fire. Commander, we cannot sustain this much longer. Thalvos looked at the tactical display one final time, at the overwhelming, patient, disciplined force surrounding what remained of his once proud fleet, and made the hardest decision of his long career. Lower our weapons, he said quietly. Signal the human fleet. The Ashwin Talon surrenders. Aboard the human cruiser closest to the flagship, the order to accept the surrender reached Captain Daniel Okoye within moments, relayed directly from the command center beneath the moon. He had spent the last several minutes watching the Ashwin Talon absorb strike after strike, its shields flickering, and its hull scarred by weapons fire. And some part of him, the part that remembered his grandmother's stories about her lost brother, felt a grim satisfaction at watching a Krill flagship brought so low. But there was another part of him, quieter and steadier, that recognized the moment for what it was, not a moment for vengeance, but a moment for proving something far more important. All weapons, hold fire, he ordered his crew. Prepare a boarding party and medical support. We're bringing them in, not finishing them off. His weapons officer, a young lieutenant named Priya Malhotra, glanced at him, with an expression caught somewhere between understanding and old, inherited resentment. Captain, with respect, that's the ship that led 3 of the escort strikes against our northern flank. They killed people today. They did, Okoye agreed quietly. And we could kill every last one of them right now, if that's what this operation was about. But it isn't. Admiral Cross made that clear from the very first briefing, 6 years ago, and she's made it clear again today. We're not here to become the thing that hurt us 40 years ago. We're here to make sure it never happens again. Those aren't the same goal, Lieutenant, and it matters that we remember the difference. He softened slightly, understanding the weight behind her words. Your family lost someone in the old war too, didn't they? My grandfather, Malhotra said quietly, never made it home. Mine too, Okoye said. That's exactly why we can't let today become about revenge. We build something better than that, or none of it means anything. He turned back to his console, watching the Ashwind Talon power down its weapons fully. Hold fire. Prepare to receive their surrender signal. The formal process of accepting the Krill fleet's surrender took several careful hours, conducted with a precision and procedural correctness that surprised even some of the surviving Krill officers, who had expected, at best, the cold formality of a defeated enemy being processed as spoils of war. Instead, human boarding parties moved through the crippled vessels methodically, treating wounded Krill crew members alongside their own casualties, securing weapons systems without unnecessary destruction, and documenting the condition of each ship with a thoroughness that spoke less of triumph and more of careful, disciplined procedure. Aboard the Ashwind Talon itself, a human medical officer named Dr. Sarah Chen led a small team through the damaged lower decks, treating injured Krill crew members with the same calm efficiency she would have shown her own people. One young Krill technician, badly burned along one arm from a ruptured conduit, watched her work with visible confusion. Why help us? He asked, his translator device rendering the question in halting, careful human speech. You have won. We are no threat to you now. Chen considered the question as she finished securing a bandage. Because helping people who need it isn't something we decided to stop doing, just because those people happened to be our enemy, an hour ago, she said simply. That's not weakness. It's just who we decided to be. A long time ago, after we learned some very hard lessons about what happens when the wrong lessons get learned instead. The young technician said nothing further, but he watched her work with a growing, uneasy sense that everything he had been taught about humanity, about its weakness, its irrelevance, its status as a defeated and forgotten footnote, had been built on assumptions that no longer held any truth at all. In the command center beneath the moon, Admiral Cross watched the final reports come in, confirming the full surrender of the Krill fleet, and allowed herself, finally, a long, slow breath of something that was not quite relief and not quite triumph, but sat somewhere quietly between the two. Final tally, General Tan reported, his voice carrying the same careful restraint that had defined the entire operation. 2 Krill escort vessels destroyed, 1 midline warship surrendered mid-battle, 1 escort crippled and boarded, crew evacuated safely. The flagship and 2 remaining midline warships have surrendered fully. Our own losses across the entire engagement, 3 ships destroyed, 11 damaged, total casualties still being confirmed, but estimated well below worst-case projections. Cross absorbed the numbers carefully. 3 human ships lost. Real people, real crews, gone in an engagement that had otherwise unfolded almost exactly as planned. It was a victory by any measure that mattered, achieved with a fraction of the losses the old war had inflicted on humanity. But it was not a victory without cost, and she made herself remember that clearly, the same way she made herself remember the names etched into the black glass panels of the archive. Get me a full casualty report as soon as it's ready, she said quietly. I want to know every name. Every one of them earned that much from me, at least. Tan nodded, understanding, without needing further explanation. He had served under Cross long enough to know that for her, victory was never separate from the cost required to achieve it, and that the careful, disciplined restraint she had insisted on throughout Operation Anvil came from the same place as her insistence on knowing every name of every person lost in achieving it. And the surrendered fleet? He asked. What are your orders for the prisoners? Treat them fairly, Cross said. full medical care for the wounded, proper housing and provisions for the rest, and open communication with Krill authorities regarding the terms of their eventual return. I want every single one of them to go home able to tell an honest story about what happened here, not a story built on cruelty or humiliation. The truth is powerful enough on its own. We don't need to exaggerate it. Outside the command center, across the quiet expanse of the Sol system, the last of the fighting had ended. 8 Krill ships that had followed a false signal into the very heart of humanity's most carefully guarded secret now sat disabled or docked under human control, their crews beginning the long, difficult process of understanding exactly what they had just witnessed, and what it would mean for the empire they served once the full truth finally made its way home. That night, if the endless cycle of a space station's artificial day and night could be called a night at all, Lieutenant Priya Okafor sat alone in the small mess hall aboard her station, still processing everything she had watched unfold across her sensor display over the last several hours. The battle had ended almost exactly as the simulations predicted, and yet nothing about living through the real version of it had felt anything like a simulation. David Reyes found her there, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and sat down across from her without asking permission, sliding 1 cup toward her. "You did good work today," he said. "I mostly just watched numbers on a screen," Okafor said. "Real people were out there fighting. Real people died. I don't know if I did anything that counts as good work." "Every one of those numbers on your screen helped keep our ships positioned correctly," Reyes said. "Helped make sure the trap closed the way it was supposed to. That matters, even if it doesn't feel like it from where you were sitting." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "First real engagement is always like this. You spend so much time training for the moment itself that nobody prepares you for what it feels like afterward, sitting with everything that happened." Okafor turned her cup slowly in her hands, thinking of the 8 Krill ships she had tracked across her display for hours, thinking of the 2 that had been destroyed, of the crews aboard them who had followed their commander into a trap none of them ever saw coming. "Do you think they understand yet? What we actually did today, I mean. Not just that they lost, but why we let so many of them live." "I think some of them will," Reyes said. "Maybe not all of them, not right away. Old certainties don't die easy, even when the evidence is sitting right in front of you. But it only takes a few people carrying the truth home for the rest to eventually have to reckon with it." He looked at her steadily. "That's kind of the whole point, isn't it? We didn't build this operation just to win one battle. We built it so that the next time, and the time after that, nobody even bothers trying." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, 2 officers among thousands across the system, each quietly processing the weight of a day that would be remembered, studied, and retold for generations, long after either of them had any say in how the story would eventually be told. Aboard the disabled Ashwin Talon, now under careful human guard, while repair crews assessed the extent of the damage, Fleet Commander Thal Voss sat alone in his private quarters for the first time since the battle had ended, turning over in his mind every decision he had made from the moment the New Haven signal first reached his sensors. He thought of his own certainty, so absolute, so unshakable, that humanity remained the same broken, defeated species his empire had crushed 40 years before. He thought of Dorn Kale's early caution, dismissed too easily, and of the quiet, steady voice of the human admiral, who had spoken to him not with hatred, but with something closer to respect, even as she calmly informed him that his entire fleet sat trapped and doomed. A soft chime sounded at his door, and when he opened it, he found Dorn Kale standing outside, still in uniform, looking as though he too had spent the last several hours unable to sleep. "I came to ask what happens now, Commander," Dorn Kale said. "To us, to the Empire, once this becomes known." Thal Voss considered the question carefully before answering, the same way he had considered every question since the terrible clarity of the battle's end had settled over him. "I do not know what happens to the Empire," he admitted. "That is a question for others, wiser and more powerful than either of us, to answer. But I know what I intend to do, once we are permitted to return home. I intend to tell the truth, exactly and completely, about what we saw here today, no matter how uncomfortable that truth may be for those who would rather keep believing the old, comfortable story about a defeated, harmless little species, not worth remembering." Dorn Kale nodded slowly. "You believe they will listen?" "I do not know," Thal Voss said honestly, But I owe it to every officer I led into this trap, and to every officer who did not survive it, to try. Silence fell over the battle space as the last of the Krill weapons powered down. In the command center beneath the moon, the report reached Admiral Cross within seconds of the surrender signal going out. "Confirmed, Admiral," the communications officer said. "HFY Talon has lowered weapons and shields. All remaining Krill vessels are following the flagship's lead. 2 escorts destroyed, 1 crippled and boarded. 1 midline warship surrendered earlier in the engagement. The flagship and 2 remaining midline warships have just gone dark on weapons." Cross closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself, finally, to feel the weight of 9 years lifting slightly from her shoulders. It was not over. Not really. Not in any way that mattered beyond this single battle in a single system. But the trap had worked. The plan had worked. And more importantly, it had worked without becoming the massacre it so easily could have been. "Cease fire, all fleets," she ordered. "Move to secure the surrendered vessels. Medical teams on standby. In case any of their crews need assistance, we can provide." She paused, then added, "Treat their wounded the way you would treat our own. Whatever else happens next, we do not need to be cruel to prove a point." Aboard the HFY Talon, Fleet Commander Thal Voss stood at the center of a bridge filled with smoke and the acrid smell of overheated systems, watching through the main view screen as human vessels moved carefully into position around his crippled fleet. He had commanded ships into battle for most of his adult life, had faced death and defeat in small measures before, but nothing had prepared him for the particular weight of this moment, surrendering not to an enemy who had simply outfought him, but to one who had spent decades quietly preparing for exactly this encounter, while his own empire filed humanity away as a footnote not worth remembering. A young human officer's voice came through the comm channel, calm and professional. "Krill vessel HFY Talon, this is Human Defense Fleet boarding party. Please power down all weapon systems and prepare to receive contact. Your surrender has been accepted. Your crew will be treated according to the terms of interstellar conduct regarding prisoners of war." Thal Voss looked at Dorn Kale, whose earlier caution now seemed less like nervousness and more like the only clear-eyed judgment on the entire bridge. "You were right to doubt," Thal Voss said quietly. "I did not listen closely enough." "None of us did, Commander," Dorn Kale replied. "I do not think anyone could have imagined this." Hours later, in a secured chamber aboard one of the human warships, Thal Voss sat across a plain metal table from Admiral Elena Cross for the first time, face to face, rather than through a comm channel. She looked, he thought, unremarkable in almost every way. Not young, not particularly imposing, dressed in a simple gray uniform without excessive decoration, and yet this was the woman who had spent 9 years building the trap that had just dismantled his entire fleet. "You could have destroyed us completely," Thal Voss said, breaking the silence first. "Your fleet had the strength for it many times over. Why show restraint?" Around them, human guards stood at a respectful distance, close enough to respond if needed, far enough to allow the conversation the privacy it seemed to require. Through a narrow viewport along one wall, the pale blue curve of Earth was visible, quiet and untroubled, exactly the way it had looked for the entire duration of the battle that had just reshaped the balance of power between two species. Cross considered the question carefully before answering. "Because that was never the point of this operation," she said. "My people were nearly destroyed once, decades ago, by a species that saw us as an obstacle too small to think about carefully. We spent every year since, making sure that could never happen again. But making sure it could never happen again did not require us to become the same kind of enemy that hurt us in the first place." She leaned back slightly. "You followed a false signal here, because you believed my species was still the same weak, defeated people your empire crushed 40 years ago. I wanted you to understand, clearly and completely, that we are not. I did not need to destroy your fleet to prove that. I only needed you to survive long enough to carry the truth back to your empire." Thal Voss studied her for a long moment. "And what truth is that, exactly?" "That humanity is no longer an easy war," Cross said simply. "And that we never wanted to be a hard one either, if it could be avoided. That was always the harder balance to strike, Commander. Building enough strength to never be caught unprepared again, without becoming so consumed by that strength that we forgot why we built it in the first place." Thal Voss was quiet for a long moment, turning her words over carefully. "In 11 engagements," he said finally, I have never once heard a victorious commander speak of restraint as though it were the harder achievement. Victory was always simply victory, measured in ships destroyed and territory gained. You speak of it differently. Because I was raised on the memory of a defeat, not a victory, Cross said. My grandfather survived the First Correction War by accident, not by skill or strength, and he spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of everyone who didn't survive it. I grew up understanding that strength without wisdom is just another kind of danger, no different in the end from the danger it claims to protect against. We did not spend 9 years building Operation Anvil so we could become the same kind of empire that hurt us. We built it so that no one would ever again mistake our patience for weakness or our restraint for fear. That we spent 40 years turning our defeat into strength, quietly, patiently, without ever announcing it to a galaxy that had already decided we didn't matter. And that the next time someone comes looking for an easy conquest here, they should think very carefully first. In the weeks that followed the battle, as human medical teams continued treating the wounded from both fleets, and repair crews worked to restore what could be salvaged from the damaged Krill vessels, a quiet and unexpected routine began to settle over the makeshift facility where the surrendered crews were housed. It was not a prison in the way Thalvos had expected. The Krill crews were given comfortable quarters, adequate food adjusted where possible to their dietary needs, and even limited access to communications equipment that allowed them to send messages home, monitored of course, but not forbidden. Vestarn, the young escort commander who had watched his ship's shields fail against the humans' first strike, found himself spending long hours in conversation with a human logistics officer named Corporal Marcus Webb, who had been assigned to oversee provisions for the Krill prisoners. At first their exchanges were formal, cautious, limited to practical matters of supply and comfort. Over time, they grew into something closer to genuine curiosity. Your people rebuilt everything in secret, Vestarn said one evening, sitting across a small table from Webb in the modest common area set aside for the prisoners. For 9 years, that is longer than my entire career as an officer. How does a species keep such a thing hidden for so long, across so many people? Webb considered the question. I think it helped that we already knew what it felt like to be underestimated, he said. My grandmother used to tell me that the hardest part wasn't building the ships or training the crews. It was convincing an entire population to be patient, to accept sacrifice without glory, for almost a decade, without ever losing faith that it would be worth it in the end. And was it? Vestarn asked. Worth it, I mean. Webb thought of the casualty reports he had read, of the names of human crew members lost in the battle, names that would be added to memorials alongside those from the First Correction War. I think that's a question every person who lived through it will have to answer for themselves, he said honestly. But I know this. Nobody in this system has to wonder anymore whether we could be caught unprepared again. That matters. Whether it was worth every cost, I suppose we'll understand better with time. The news of what had happened in the Sol system traveled slowly at first, filtered carefully through official channels on both sides. The Krill Empire, unwilling to admit publicly that a fleet of 8 ships had been trapped and defeated by a species it had long dismissed as harmless, initially reported the engagement as a minor skirmish with unclear results. But truth, as it so often does, found its way through the cracks eventually. Surviving Krill crew members, released along with their disabled ships as part of the terms Admiral Cross negotiated personally, carried their accounts back to Krill space, and those accounts spread, first through quiet conversations among officers, then through more formal channels, until eventually, the full scope of what had happened became impossible to hide. Humanity, for its part, did not celebrate loudly. There were no grand parades, no triumphant declarations broadcast across every human colony. Admiral Cross insisted on this personally, arguing before the Joint Human Command Council that the victory at Sol should be treated not as a moment of glory, but as proof that patience and preparation had finally paid off after decades of quiet, careful work. We did not win this by being louder than our enemy, she told the council in a private address that would only become public years later. We won it by being smarter, more disciplined, and more patient than anyone believed we were capable of being. That is not something to celebrate with parades. That is something to carry forward quietly, the same way we built it. Some members of the council pushed back against her caution. A representative from one of the outer colonies, still bearing the scars of the First Correction War, in the form of a family that had never fully recovered from its losses, argued that humanity had earned the right to declare its strength openly, to stop hiding, and start standing tall among the other species of the galaxy. "We spent 40 years being afraid," the representative said. "Don't we deserve to stop being afraid now?" Cross had heard versions of this argument many times over the years of planning Operation Anvil, and she answered it now the same way she always had. "Being quiet about our strength isn't the same as being afraid of it," she said. "We built this fleet to make sure we never have to be afraid again. Not so we could trade one kind of danger for another. A species that announces its strength to the whole galaxy invites exactly the kind of attention that got us into trouble the first time. Let our strength speak through our actions when it needs to, and let our patience be the thing people remember about us. That's a harder path, I know, but I believe it's the right one." In the end, the council voted, narrowly but decisively, to follow her recommendation. The story of what happened in the Sol system would be shared honestly with any species that asked, but it would not be broadcast as propaganda or celebrated as a triumph over a defeated enemy. It would simply stand, quietly, as a fact that the galaxy would need to reckon with in its own time. Fleet Commander Thal Voss returned to Krill space several months later, along with the surviving crew of the Ashwind Talon and the other captured vessels, released under terms that surprised the Krill High Command almost as much as the defeat itself had. He stood before a council of Krill military leaders, men and women who had spent their careers believing humanity was a settled matter, a footnote from an old war not worth revisiting, and told them plainly what he had seen. "They let us go," he said, "not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough not to need to prove it through cruelty. I have fought 11 engagements in my career, and I tell you honestly, nothing prepared me for what I saw in that system. 312 warships, hidden for 9 years without a single leak, without a single mistake, waiting patiently for an enemy who believed them defeated." He looked around the chamber at the gathered officers, some skeptical, some already beginning to understand the weight of what he was telling them. "If this empire ever considers humanity an easy target again, I promise you, it will be the last mistake this empire ever makes." The council did not fully believe him at first. Old certainties, built over 40 years of comfortable assumption, do not die easily, even in the face of clear evidence. One senior counselor, an aging military strategist named Voth Kar, who had helped plan the original campaign of the First Correction War, openly challenged Thal Voss's account before the full assembly. "You ask us to believe that a single species, one we defeated so thoroughly 40 years ago that it took them 4 months to beg for peace, somehow built a fleet capable of trapping and defeating 8 of our own warships without our intelligence networks ever noticing," Voth Kar said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man unwilling to accept a challenge to everything his career had been built upon. "Forgive me, Fleet Commander, but this sounds less like a report and more like an excuse for a defeat you failed to prevent." Thal Voss had expected resistance, had prepared himself for exactly this kind of challenge during the long journey home. He did not raise his voice or lose his composure, understanding that anger would only make his account easier to dismiss. "I understand your doubt, Counselor," he said. "I shared it myself, right up until the moment their shields absorbed a full volley from my fleet, without measurable damage. I do not ask you to simply believe my word. I ask you to review the sensor logs recovered from every surviving ship, to speak with every surviving officer who witnessed what happened, and to weigh that evidence honestly, whatever conclusion it leads you toward. I did not survive that battle to come home and lie about it. I survived it to make certain this empire never makes the mistake of underestimating humanity again." The debate that followed stretched across several long sessions, as more evidence was gathered and reviewed, as surviving crew members from every rank gave their own accounts, each one corroborating the others, in ways that grew increasingly difficult to dismiss. Slowly, session by session, the weight of consistent, careful testimony began to shift even the most stubborn opinions in the room. But the reports kept coming, confirmed again and again by independent sources, and slowly, carefully, the Krill Empire began to reconsider everything it thought it understood about the small, quiet, distant species it had once crushed and forgotten. Back on Earth, Admiral Elena Cross stood once more in the archive, the quiet chamber beneath the moon base, where the names of the First Correction War's dead were etched into black glass panels. She had visited this room every year for as long as she could remember, but this visit felt different from all the others that came before it. She reached out and touched the cold glass gently, running her fingers along names she had read 100 times, names of soldiers who had died believing their sacrifice might not be enough to save the species they had fought for. It worked, she said quietly, to no one, to everyone, to the memory of every person whose name was etched into that wall. We're not forgotten anymore. We're not a footnote. Whatever comes next, they know that now. Behind her, General Marcus Tan waited quietly by the door, giving her the moment she needed. When she finally turned to leave, he fell into step beside her without a word, and together they walked out of the archive and back into the bright, ordinary light of the corridors above, where the work of building a safer future, patiently and quietly, as it always had been, continued on. What happens now? Tan asked as they walked, his voice quiet in the wide, empty corridor. Now that the secret is out, now that the whole galaxy is going to know exactly what humanity built, and exactly what we're capable of. Cross considered the question for a long moment before answering. Now we keep building, she said. Not because we expect another war tomorrow, but because the lesson of the last 9 years wasn't really about the Krill Empire specifically. It was about understanding that safety isn't something you achieve once and then stop working for. It's something you have to keep choosing, year after year, generation after generation, whether anyone is watching or not. That sounds exhausting, Tan said, though there was no real complaint in his voice, only the tired acknowledgement of a man who had spent 9 years of his own life on exactly that work. It is, Cross agreed, but it's a lot less exhausting than losing everything, because we stopped paying attention at the wrong moment. She glanced sideways at him. Besides, I don't think either of us knows how to do anything else at this point. Tan allowed himself a small, tired smile at that, the first genuine smile either of them had shared since long before the battle began. No, he admitted. I suppose we don't. Years later, historians across a dozen different species would still debate the precise lessons to be drawn from what came to be known simply as the Saul incident. Some argued it proved the value of patience and long-term planning over short-term shows of strength. Others focused on the restraint humanity had shown in victory, arguing it set a new standard for how a stronger power ought to treat a defeated enemy. Still others simply marveled at the sheer discipline required to keep a secret of that scale hidden for nearly a decade, across thousands of people, without a single meaningful leak. For Admiral Elena Cross, none of those debates ever mattered quite as much as the simple, private truth she carried with her for the rest of her life, that the names etched into the black glass panels of the archive had not been forgotten, and that the species they had died defending was no longer the kind of species anyone could safely mistake for weak, or broken, or finished. The story of the alien fleet that followed a human SOS signal straight into Earth's secret trap would eventually become one of the most studied engagements in galactic military history, told and retold across a dozen different species, each one drawing its own lesson from what had happened in that quiet corner of space. But for the people who had actually lived it, who had spent 9 years building a trap in silence and patience, the lesson was always simpler than any textbook could capture. Never mistake quiet for weakness, never mistake patience for surrender, and never, under any circumstances, assume that a wound, however deep, marks the end of a story, rather than merely its beginning.